So as we both know, our pupils' experiences with place value and with unitizing and the things that are fundamental to development and understanding, they happen much earlier. Sounds really smarmy. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that gives time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And together we're going to explore place value. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
As you know, usually when I come to say what I've been reading this week, I will describe it very briefly. I'll say the title and then I'll cop out a little bit rather than explaining what it's really about by just saying, yeah, it's an interesting paper, go and read this, which is usually my way of lacking any sense of courage because I don't want anyone to hear my poor understanding of the paper. This week, I'm going to throw myself in the deep end a little bit and actually try and at least briefly explain what I understand from a particular paper. It is a subsumption theory of meaningful learning and retention by Ausubel from 1962. And it is fascinating, but like I say, I'm not going to stop there. One of the underlying assumptions behind the paper is that we can think of knowledge in terms of concepts that are hierarchically organized. So for example, we might think of living things as a higher order concept, and that higher order concept subsumes the slightly lower order concept of animals, which subsumes the concept of mammals, etc., all the way down. Now, one of the other assumptions behind this paper is that meaningful learning involves learning that is connected in some way to something else. It isn't disconnected. It is ideally connected to one of these subsuming or directly higher order concepts. And the cool thing about this theory is that it suggests that forgetting when you have learned something disconnected or something rote is different to forgetting when you've learned something in a meaningful fashion. When you've learned something in a meaningful fashion, what Ausubel suggests is that this new concept, when you forget it, undertakes something called obliterative subsumption, where the higher order concept almost like absorbs it. So let's say you've learned about mammals recently, and then you go to learn about different kinds of mammal, and you learn about a koala. Over time, you forget this particular specialized instance of a mammal as it's absorbed by the higher order concept of mammals. So you forget about koalas because it's been absorbed by the higher order concept. Whereas with rote learning, forgetting happens with a different process. So this is where this idea of advanced organizers, where you start off with the subsuming higher order concepts, comes from. And there's loads of interesting stuff there, but I hope there's enough there to spark your interest. The only reason I've been brave enough to talk about this a little bit more is because I've been fortunate enough to have some discussions on this subject with the brilliant Sarah Cottingham, who's kind of guiding me through the basics of this stuff. So if you ever see her talking about this stuff or writing blogs or whatever about this stuff, I'd highly recommend you check them out because, yeah, she knows her stuff and she's a fantastic writer. So that's what I've been reading this week. I hope you can tell I'm a bit enthused by it. What about you, Kieran? What are you reading for?
Yeah, you're right. That is fascinating. And Sarah's been on fire recently. It seems like every week she's got a new blog or thread that's absolutely setting things on fire and really getting to the heart of some really important stuff. So I think, I only wish that we had a season closer than we do so that I could get to spend 2-3 hours talking to Sarah about education, so hopefully touch wood one day and maybe even as part of a chat before we get to a big interview. I've not been reading, but I've got something that I've been watching which links to what we're going to explore today. And it's a course by Jonathan Hall on the Complete Math CPD College. It's called Place Value, Base 10 and Beyond. And essentially it starts with numbers, numerals, and digits, but we work our way through different bases all the way to multiplication and division in multi-base. And in terms of extending my thinking about place value, you know, in the Discord, Atul Rana has been running almost like a book club, but with this video. So at the start, we would watch maybe 5 minutes of a video, and then Atul would have a task for us. Now we've actually gone beyond where the videos are at the minute. And so we were looking at numbers sort of smaller than zero, you know, parts of a whole. I would like to say decimals, but they're not called decimals in every base. So I can't, you know, what would you say, radix. And so essentially what we do is we spend half an hour together exploring different bases and, you know, and building up our understanding. We've been doing it for a couple of months now. And actually this course has been central to sort of making me think a little bit more differently, a little bit more deeply about place value. So yeah, I highly recommend it. And some of the courses on there are free, but I think I pay £84 a year. And for the quality of the CPD courses, you know, I'm not trying to sell it, but I think it's a steal.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I remember about 12 months ago at my last school, I mentioned to the vice principal that I was looking to buy in some professional development. I thought it would benefit my understanding of mathematics. And he said, "Oh, how much is it?" And he actually laughed at me when I said it was 84 quid. It was like, yeah, we can do that. That's not a problem. So yeah, I know compared to a lot of stuff, it's obviously a drop in the ocean. But I know there's a lot of good stuff on there, Kieran, not least, dare I say, the bits and pieces I'm sure you've contributed to.
Yeah, eight courses as part of the Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics sort of series. Yeah, I was quite proud of them, but I haven't watched any of them back. I think we might get to those in Discord soon, but we've got quite a while to go in place value before we do that. Now, I'd like to explore a slightly new/different section before we get into place value, and it's basically things that we're up to that people might be interested in. So I know, Chris, that you are planning on delivering a talk maybe a week from when this episode goes out. Where is it and what's it going to be about, Chris?
You've sprung this on me, so I'm not really prepared, but yeah, I'm going to be speaking at Research Ed Berks, as I know you are as well. And yeah, it's exciting because it's the first one I've done of this thing. I've done obviously lots of CPD stuff, talks generally in the past, but not a Research Ed, nothing this brief. I mean, obviously 40 minutes. And in this case, I'm going to be speaking on the subject of reading, unsurprisingly. The idea is to try and communicate something meaningful about the breadth of reading and reading research in the space of 40 minutes. The talk is going to be called 80 words that every teacher, oh, sorry, no, hang on, I've changed it. 75 words that every teacher should understand about reading. And the idea is that even if you know loads about reading and reading research, by coming and watching, I hope you'll gain an accessible structure that can help you think about how you might support your colleagues to know more about reading and reading research. And equally, if you don't know anything about reading research, this will provide a useful jumping off point. That's the plan.
Yeah, mine is about developing an evidence-informed approach to the use of manipulatives in the classroom. I think I started with Clements and Sarama paper about the use of computer manipulatives and basically followed the sources for 65 papers. And I've come up with 4 principles that I think should guide our use of manipulatives, because it's not as clear cut as some of the media would have you believe. And so I think it's worth exploring in the depth that I have. And it's definitely not my final word on it, but I think it's really useful. I did it at Maths Conf, and there were lots of secondary teachers at the session. So, I know yours is applicable across phases, and I think mine is too, from early years up to secondary. But I'm also acutely aware that at the same time you're speaking, Bernie Westacott is going to be doing a session on manipulatives as well. So, imagine following on from that, because basically I'll have to have a spy in Bernie's session, finding out what he says, making sure it doesn't conflict with what I've said, and then changing my session so that I'm on board.
No, that makes sense. I'm also thinking about, I think I've mentioned this to you earlier, buying in a body double to kind of perform my one so I can go and watch Bernie instead. I'm in the unfortunate position compared to you that I've never actually seen him talk live. Though actually, just a heads up, based thinking about what we're going to be talking about later, it might still be available somewhere online. Bernie Westacott did a fantastic hour-long talk. I think it was free. I think it was via the Oxford University Press about place value a little while back, and it's pretty special. So yeah, that's something to check out as well.
Yeah, to my knowledge, that stuff is available on the OUP website as part of their free CPD offer, and certainly was during sort of the main bit of the pandemic where schools were closed and open and closed. Yeah, so so I think that's the big thing that's happening. And then obviously we've got the Ko-fi, to which we are very, very grateful to everyone who supports the podcast. We've done some CPD. What have I done? I've done phasing out manipulatives. Some CPD on that. Subject leadership, almost like an introduction to the very beginning of subject leadership, not just in maths. And then I think how to get the most from thinking deeply about primary mathematics. Those are the three I've stuck on there first, so that I hope it's some extra value, because you've got the podcast and you've got those sort of CPD that connects into what we're talking about as well. Focus of this episode is going to be the first of a few, I think, on place value. And obviously there's no better place to start, Chris, than with what is place value?
A place value system is a way of denoting value through the position of a set of digits. And what it allows us to do is to represent values, represent amounts with a relatively limited number of symbols. So the position of a digit helps to denote its value. So the obvious cases that we're used to with base 10 in a number like 325, we know the value of the 2. It isn't just 2, it is worth 20 or 2 tens specifically because of its position. So it's this sense of positional value. Now, if we're only used to these kinds of counting systems, this kind of structure for understanding the amounts, then we might think, well, what other ways of dealing with amounts are there? Well, for example, the counting system used in Roman numerals is not in many ways a place value system, because we have different symbols to represent different amounts, and they always do. A V is 5 wherever it is placed, whereas the digit 5 can be worth 5 or 50 or 500 in a base 10 system. So in short, the key thing about place value is that it is using the position of a digit to denote value.
The Maya, I think they represented their numbers vertically, and obviously they had sort of glyphs like a shell and a dot and dashes, and so to combine to make representations of their numbers. And yeah, so I think we talked about in the number line episode about how the number line is cultural. I think there's a cultural aspect to how number in general is represented, and you're not necessarily going to find it identical, but as a species, I think it's fair to say we have standardized how we might engage across cultures, and that comes down to different bases. I think it's almost that next step removed from, so we accept that we're going to use place value as our main, the driving force behind a representation number, and then within that there are different bases. How would you explain bases to someone who'd never heard of them before, Chris?
Well, the key idea to get across with a base is its arbitrariness. So we are so accustomed to dealing with numbers through, at least at the very beginning of learning about numbers, through how many tens are there and how many leftovers are there, that we kind of feel that this is the way numbers should be organized, and or that they are inherently organized this way, when this is a human invention, a system that we have chosen. As I say, it's entirely arbitrary. So if I were to explain base 10 as a starting point, I would probably say, well, I want you to imagine that there are 12 counters in front of you. Now, if I've got 12 counters, because of the way our number system works, we immediately recognize that that's one group of 10 and 2 leftovers. But this choice of grouping in tens is arbitrary, and it's this idea of grouping that defines the base. I could just as easily count these up in base 5 by saying that there were 2 groups of 5 and 2 leftovers, in which case, if I were to write that in base 5, it would look like 2, 2. So thinking about base 10, if I looked at that, I'd think, oh, that's 22, which would mean 2 lots of 10 and 2 leftovers. But that's not what I'm dealing with when I'm dealing in base 5. So the base is effectively the grouping that we use. Naturally, as we get with larger and larger numbers, the way that that base operates has to get more complicated. So in the case of base 10, we have leftovers, which is my way of saying ones. We then have groups of 10, but once we get to 10 lots of 10, in order to represent that using the digits we have available, we then have to say, okay, we need something new, where we go, there are 10 lots of 10, which we call 100. And each place that we move across is 10 times larger, whereas in base 5, each place that we move across, to the left in this case, we are talking about 5 times larger. What have I missed there? Does that sound like a fairly coherent explanation of what a base is? It's this idea of grouping, but obviously we then need groups of groups as we get to more complex, larger numbers.
I'm very mindful that I want to bring everybody along with us. So do stop me if I go off on a tangent that's unwarranted. But some definitions will talk about a base being the number of potential possibilities that can be represented, or the numbers can be ways numbers can be represented. So for instance, like you said, in base 5 and in base 10, you have different options for how those numbers, and it's that joke about there are 1, 0 types of people who understand binary and those who don't. I think the origin of alternatively, you could call a base a radix. And I think it's really useful to know that, because it comes from the Latin, I'm told. It's been about 2,000 years since I spoke Latin to anyone, but it comes from the Latin for root, as in, base 2 is the root. And you're almost looking at, when I look at place value, you're talking about being 10 times larger, 10 times the size. It's an expression of the distance from 0, the magnitude, when compared with 0, I think. And I don't think we do it necessarily enough at primary, but when I look at 100, I'm looking at the magnitude when sort of measuring that distance between it and 0. And when we look at things like decimalization in different bases, it's natural to say, oh, the decimal point, that point at which we have parts of a number, numbers sort of less than 0, and whole and integers. And it's very easy to think, to overgeneralize and think, well, that's what it's always called. But actually, it would be called a binary point in base 2, or a ternary point in base 3. And although it's not immediately relevant to us, I think as teachers, if we have an understanding of this level of place value, then I think we're in a better position to teach it going forward. I don't know, what do you guys, am I going off on one?
I totally agree. I don't think I really understood I don't think I understand bases to the extent that you do because of the work that you've done with Atul Rana, multiplication in different bases, etc. I find it difficult enough doing fairly basic arithmetic in other bases. And it blew my mind a little bit when I first started doing that. But I do think that in order to grasp base 10 and how it works, and the fact that it is arbitrary, you do need to understand other bases. You need to understand that that is a choice that was made at some point. Potentially, some people suggest because we have 10 fingers, and so that it's quite natural. I mean, if you were going to say, how would you express the number 23 without saying anything, you would probably show all 10 fingers, then you'd do so again, and then you'd show 3. It's quite natural to be able to think of that as, oh, there's 2 10s and 3. But it didn't have to be that way. We could just as easily have chosen, say, base 5, in which those 12 counters that I talked about could be expressed through 1 hand's worth of fingers, another hand's worth of fingers, and then 2 more. So 2 lots of 5 and 2. So I think what you mentioned there as well, just to really get a grasp of it for those that are struggling to wrap their head around this a little bit, because I remember I did when I first came across this stuff. If we think about, I talked about the, as we go up through the places, in base 10, it gets 10 times bigger, of course. So we go from 1s to 10s to 100s to 1000s. And as we go in the opposite direction into the parts that are smaller, the bits that are below the decimal point, we're looking at tenths, then hundredths, then thousandths. Equally, if we think about, say, base 5, we wouldn't be talking about tenths anymore, but below it wouldn't be called the decimal point, as you correctly point out, but below the equivalent of the decimal point would be fifths, and then 1/25ths, and then 1/125ths, because instead of getting 10 times smaller going in that direction, we'd be looking at getting 5 times smaller. Now, I've chosen 5, but again, that's an arbitrary choice. We could just as easily work in base 3, base 25, base 60, as certain ancient civilizations like the Babylonians tended to do. The key thing is this arbitrariness, and that when we're first teaching this to children, we need to make sure that they're understanding this sense of unitizing, the fact that we're making groups, and that it just happens to be that in our counting system, the key one that we deal with is groups of 10.
Yeah, funny you should say that about your hands, because I think the way we measure time comes from the Sumerians, and they would use the knuckles, or even the little, you've got like 3 little parts to your hand, and they would count those 3, and then and I think they would assign a value to it, not necessarily 1, and then they would use the other hand to identify, okay, we've got the unit, we've got X number of the unit, whatever, and eventually you would end up with them measuring. I think I don't want to say base 60 if it's not base 60, but I think that's what they worked in. And tonight, just before we recorded this episode, me and Atul looked at 3.5 in base 3, and it really illuminated, the power of learning stuff that's just a little bit further beyond your remit, because thirds in base 10 are notoriously difficult to represent. You're better off using fractions rather than decimal fractions, because you get this recurring decimal. So we looked at 3.5. And actually, when you have your thirds and your ninths and your 27ths, I was trying to get to a half. And every time I converted, I was so close, but I couldn't get it. And it was only when I had 12 27ths and I was trying to add another 27th. So how many 27ths? I can't get there. And then I realized that this is a recurring decimal in base 3. No, it's not a recurring decimal. It's a recurring ternary, I think the correct term would be. So, but it was 10.111111 forever, and you couldn't represent it in base 3. And I was like, this is what it feels like to learn something new, to connect it to what you've done. But it really showed me, it just happened that we happened to be recording about place value tonight. But it couldn't have been, timing couldn't have been any better, because it was like scales from my eyes. It had been a couple of weeks since the last time I'd spot or made a really big mistake and then learned something from it in this. So yeah, so I think you're absolutely spot on.
It is a fascinating subject. And I think the heart of it as well, what's really interesting about place value and about the idea of working in different bases is that it allows us a better sense of what's going on with arithmetic. I mean, I don't think I really understood the heart of arithmetic, or I'm sure I still don't, but I don't think I was able to explain what arithmetic really was until I started dealing with other bases. It was only when I started working with other bases that I realized that, oh, we're just reorganizing numbers to make so that we can compare them. You know, there's, when we say, for example, 3 lots of 4, that is a perfectly valid way to describe an amount. It just is 3 lots of 4. We often then go, oh, well, it's 12. Well, there's nothing answery about 12. It just so happens to be a way to organize a number whereby we say, well, you know, those 3 lots of 4, can you put them in a system that we usually deal with numbers so that I can compare that to other stuff? So 3 lots of 4, when I reorganize that, that's a 10 and 2 leftovers. And so we can start to see arithmetic as just reorganizing numbers so that we can compare with them. One thing I love to do, there's an app. Do you know is it Maths Learning Center? Is that the right name for it? The American one. I think it's called Maths Learning Center. Bernie Westcott recommends it.
The early maths.
Yeah, it's like it's the online manipulative stuff, and it might be the case that MathsBot can do something similar to this, but it has 10 frames, but you can also set up 100 frames and all sorts of stuff. And one of the things I love about setting up 100 frame is that you can put in 3 lots of 4, you know, one on top of the other in different rows, and then say, okay, what is that? And by moving them down into this 100 frame and kind of like just reorganizing them, you can see, oh, I can see now that 3 lots of 4 is a 10 and 2. And you start to visualize this idea that arithmetic is, oh, I'm just reorganizing the number so that I can grasp it in a familiar way. And to us, a familiar way to compare numbers and to think about numbers is through base 10. We're so familiar with base 10 that if someone says, you know, 72, we can possibly visualize it. We can possibly get a sense of what that is. Whereas if I said, you know, in base 5, the 3 digits 3, 6, 4 in base 5, you'd be like, what is that? How does that even work? Because we're so unfamiliar with it. So yeah, in some ways, I think that when we describe place value and arithmetic as 2 separate things, rather than just arithmetic being an extension of place value and understanding place value and playing with place value, I think we might sometimes give a false impression. I much rather think of arithmetic as an extension of place value, an understanding of it.
Yeah, whenever I saw you were going to ask that question about the relationship between arithmetic and place value, I thought, well, isn't arithmetic just a contextual expression of the idea? Because like you said, if I were to work out what 3, 2, 5 were in base 5, I would need to go, right, 5 times, there's 5 units, there are 2 lots of 5, and then there are 3 lots of 25. I would need to do some arithmetic to work out the value being expressed. The only reason I don't do that in base 10 is because I've been working with base 10 for 30 plus years, and it has become internalized, so I can see those representations. And, you know, we talk about the structures of arithmetic, and I know Haylock likes the definition where he talks about the structures being contexts, and, you know, it's the contextualization of mathematics that sort of defines the structure, so to speak. And certainly it's what draws the distinction between different types of addition. So I think, you know, when I couldn't see a distinction to be drawn, I think the way we teach, you know, where we will typically start with place value and then look at those applications, I think that probably makes sense, but perhaps we could draw the connections a little bit more firmly with our pupils. But I think, you know, having spent months, you know, we've spent 30 minutes on a Wednesday night every week for months, just going through this one course really slowly. I think you would need a lot of space in the curriculum to go into base and to go into multi-base at primary. I think it's possible. But to go into the way it deserves to be gone into, we would need to almost start from scratch and make it the priority, and then reconsider how we taught place value in general.
I think there's some room, even in a limited sense, within our current national curriculum to highlight the idea of different bases right from the very beginning. I mean, that might sound, given how complicated it might, the stuff we've described so far might sound if you're not that familiar with this aspect of mathematics. I do think it's possible perhaps to go there. And in particular, what I mean is that if at the very beginning of dealing with numbers, when we're introducing children to the idea of numbers greater than 10 or 10 or greater, if we start by saying, oh, how many groups of 2 can we make here, and how many ones or how many leftovers are there, and you do that with a pile of 7, how many groups of 3 can we make with, and how many leftover? And we do that a few times with different groups, making sure that children are obviously already aware, perhaps can subitize with those into those groups. Once we then go, okay, we're now going to be focusing for a while on a particular number, which is 10. We're going to be in particular looking at grouping things into sets of 10 with some leftovers. And that's how we introduce the idea of numbers greater than 10. We start saying we can write this amount here where you've got maybe 13 counters, and say we can write this as 1 10 and 3 1s, and present it like that, so that there's this at least initial introduction to the key idea of unitizing, the key idea that we're saying groups and then ones, or groups and leftovers. I think that might be a way just to hint at it to begin with. And then maybe by emphasizing this idea, this hinting at this idea of arbitrariness, then later on in the curriculum, when we start to say, well, you know, for years we've been talking about putting things into groups of 10 and then some ones. Let's explore today what numbers might look like if instead we were putting things into groups of 5, for example. And yes, I absolutely agree. There's certainly value to be had in going deep into an understanding of different bases. But even if we don't have the time or the understanding of it to go there, I think there's like a limited version that can be part of the everyday maths curriculum.
Let's change it a little bit then, right? Because the situation you're describing requires quite a skillful and knowledgeable teacher, I would posit. So in this age of almost outlining exactly what beginning teachers and student teachers should learn about during their time, do you think we could overcome a lot of the subject knowledge issues we face with our least experienced teachers, or that our least experienced teachers face themselves, by focusing heavily early on in teacher training in a course that explored multi-base to the depths to which we're sort of almost touching on in this interview, in this chat? Do you think that would alleviate a lot of the issues that teachers have when it comes to subject knowledge further down the line?
Absolutely, 100%. I think it's going to sound a bit out there, particularly, as I say, if you're not familiar with different bases. But actually, even on the basics, even half an hour to an hour of talking about different bases and operating with them, just so you have that realization, that key realization that there are other bases than base 10, and that base 10 is an arbitrary choice that we've made. I think that just illuminates so much of what we're talking about. As we say, it illuminates this idea that arithmetic is merely an extension of our understanding of, in this case, base 10, of place value more generally. I don't think you really grasp this stuff. You do grasp this stuff well enough to teach it, but I think by grasping it a little bit more, going into this extra detail, I think it has to advantage teaching. I'd also say that I don't even think that this is something that is, once you're familiar with it, it doesn't feel like it's hugely challenging. It doesn't feel to me like, oh, wow, if I'd done A-level maths, that's where this would have been. Once you understand it, you think, oh, okay, this should have been in my this is what I should have learned in primary mathematics. It doesn't feel unbelievably complicated. It just feels like something obvious that should have been included in our understanding of what counting is and what arithmetic is as well, of course.
I imagine it's probably like learning Italian if you're Spanish. It's slightly different, but when you get under the skin of it, it's very, very similar. And you're applying lots of the same principles. I don't know, obviously, I'm not a Spanish person who has learned Italian, so I can't imagine. But because English has no relatives close enough for that comparison to be made, I can only hypothesize. I don't know.
I think there's a bit of, again, it's probably a bit of a reach, but I think there's potentially a bit of variation theory in here as well, because if you know, if you're introduced to what a dog is and you see one dog, yeah, you've got an idea of what dogs are, but it's when you see a variety and you see different ones and perhaps things that aren't, that you get a sense of, a better, grasp on this concept. Equally, if you've only ever dealt with base 10, you don't even realize that this is an arbitrary choice, then how do you recognize really what base 10 is? At the moment, for most teachers, I would imagine, who haven't looked at other bases, base 10 is the water in which they swim. So they can't really understand it itself because it's just how they've always dealt with numbers. And getting outside that for a moment allows you to perceive it a bit better. I would imagine it certainly did for me.
That's why we end up with challenge being equated with larger numbers rather than different bases. And going back to what Mark McCord says about the infinite depth of mathematics, there's no better example than when he teaches this really interesting generalization with them. Is it 1089 is the shorthand for this investigation? I know on enrichmath.org they call it subtraction surprise, but essentially you end up making these generalizations where you're working in base 10, you're working in base 8, and then you're working with letters too, and you see why it works the way it works. And I think it's probably a light bulb moment for most people when they see what's really possible with place value compared with how we may have been encouraged prior to the introduction of the 2014 national curriculum to accelerate as close to the tens of millions as we possibly could. But I think I've said before in the podcast, and I've certainly said to everybody who listens in real life, humans don't understand quantities greater than those they can physically experience. Like we don't understand time greater than our own lifespan. And so when we think about 1,000 people, I'm not sure we really can distinguish between 1,000 people and 100 people, not to any great level of accuracy. And then when we look at 10,000 years and 1,000 years, certainly to me, they feel just as far away. And so I think, it's about, where our priorities are. And it certainly shouldn't be looking at tens of millions or billions, because, when you talk about the wealth of people who have trillions of dollars, I don't know what that means. That seems just as rich as someone who's got a couple of £100,000 in the bank. I really don't, I don't get it. And it could just be me. I could just not understand numbers to the same depth as everybody else. But that combining those two bits together, I think sort of sets your priorities for place value in the classroom. It's about how rich can this be, as opposed to how great the magnitude can be.
Yeah, and I think the zenith of that negative idea is when we start getting children to use written methods for 6 or 7 digit numbers, and you think, why? Why on earth are we getting children to add or subtract with 6 or 7 digit numbers? Kind of the point of understanding place value to this extent, so that you can then use certain procedures to deal with arithmetic, is that you then recognize, it works with any set of numbers and or any size of number, and then saying that you have to, okay, so let's take that up to 6 or 7 digits. Well, yeah, I don't really see the point in spending a huge amount of time on that. I think generally also I'm a bit of a bit radical, what I might say, when it comes to written methods and their purpose in the curriculum. I think because of the nature of our modern world, I think the only real purpose behind, over the longer term, behind written methods is to better understand our number system and how to deal with it. That's it. I mean, if you think that anyone out there is on a day-by-day basis multiplying 4-digit numbers by 2-digit numbers on a piece of paper, then you've lost it. The only reason to deal with that is so that you get a better grasp of the distributive property. You know, that's why you deal with that. So you start to see how that works. Yeah, so I think it's another way in which place value and arithmetic are connected, in that when we're talking about written methods, written arithmetic, in the back of our mind should be, I am doing this to help children grasp what we've described so far as place value, in particular, in this case, base 10, and then ideally how that will apply to other bases. So we've talked a lot about different bases and place value. Thinking about reception and then year 1, year 2, what does that look like there?
I mean, when we're talking about reception, I think there are 3 key principles of counting that lead to the rest of mathematics. One-to-one correspondence, stable order, and cardinality. I think once you have those 3, those would be the first 3 things I try to teach any pupil, or try to help pupils realize in reception. Once you get those 3, you can then begin to supertize with small numbers. I know the supertizing sort of with 3 objects seems to happen naturally, you know, maybe preschool, slightly earlier, you know, when the kids are about 3 years old. But certainly I'm thinking, what do I want pupils to be able to understand when, as they go through reception? I think those 3 allow you to supertize. They allow you to draw comparisons later on, and then you can start going into almost the sequence that's formulated within the primary national curriculum. You know, I think, you know, because in reception, you're almost circling within the 1 year, you are circling around the same ideas, but with increasingly larger numbers. So for instance, you're supertizing within 5 initially, you know, perhaps perceptual supertizing within 5, perceptual supertizing within 7, conceptual supertizing within 5, 7, 10, and then you're probably, I think, into year 1, or the mathematics that 6 and 7-year-olds might encounter. And this is just me spitballing. You know, I have spent time thinking about this sequence recently, but you know, it's beyond me to remember everything that I have sort of written down. And then I think, you know, I think I've definitely spoken about it before. My year 1 and year 2 is very, very similar to that process, where you've got the same big mathematical ideas, but you're revisiting them with slightly larger numbers. And for me, it'd probably be within 10, within 20, within 40, and then maybe within 100 when you're in year 2. But I do think there's time for that in year 3. And so that's how I would start the journey. Because I think if you've got those principles of counting, and then are developing an awareness and a sense of number, and obviously I haven't included absolutely everything that would count towards that sense of number, that's where you get a rich understanding of everything that comes later.
I think something I've already mentioned and that you've implicitly hit upon is the idea of unitizing, the idea that we can put things into groups and recognize them then as a single thing. I mean, I think a key moment in mathematical development is when children see 3 or 4 or 5 or 2, whatever it is, and then they say, that is not just 5 objects, but we can think of it as a 5. And I think the value is really, sorry, the words are really important there. The use in particular of the indefinite article there is so meaningful, because the difference between 5 and a 5 or a group of 5 is this process of saying that set of things is now, or sorry, that selection of things is now a set. It's a group that I can deal with. And I think I would want to do lots of work that made that really visually clear. So if we were saying bears in baskets or counters in cups or whatever it might be, lots of work that involved, let's put 3 in here and 3 in here and 3 in here. Let's put 2 in here and 2. Lots of work involving physically grouping things as a way of understanding this idea of sets, this idea of unitizing. I think that's foundational in reception. I think you're absolutely on the money when you're talking about the power and the importance of supertizing in this as well. I mean, there's a couple of aspects to this. Obviously, there's just the importance of supertizing itself for understanding number and for dealing with arithmetic and for, you know, being able to recognize that 2 and 3 is 5 quite quickly and quite visually, because you can perceptually supertize 2 and 3 and 5 is really valuable. But also in practical terms, down the line, when we start to deal with 10 frames, in particular, full 10 frames, and then some leftovers, and then even further down the line, when we start to deal with Dinesh, I never know how to pronounce it. Let's go with Deans. We'll stick with Deans. But with Dean's blocks, the difference between a child who can look at 34 in Dean's and go, well, there's 3 10s, there's 4 1s, it's 34, compared to a child that perhaps, because they've not had those experiences with supertizing, go 1 2 3 10s and 1 2 3 4 1s. They have to count them up. I think that is a real impediment over the longer term to their use of manipulatives. So that is going to support the understanding of place value. So I think supertizing has that kind of practical role to play. Just alongside that, I'm just thinking about the amount of times I've seen teachers teaching place value in, say, year 2, and they show 38 with Deans under a visualizer, and the 3 10s are nicely lined up. And then the 8 is just a collection, just a random collection. And I say, well, we've got 3 10s. And then, so what have we got here, everyone? And the kids are desperately trying to work out. And then you see a teacher in comparison who organizes the ones that are there into either in a pairwise structure that children will have experienced in a 10 frame, or a 5 and a bit structure. So there's 5 and 3 more, so that they're organized. The difference between the learning for children when the teacher is taking that care in how they use Dean's blocks is, yeah, it's a massive difference, because they can, going back to what you've described before, they can conceptually supertize that so much more easily, because, well, there's 3 10s, there's 8 1s, it's 38, without having to kind of count up. So yeah, that was a long way around to say that unitizing and obviously the power of supertizing is what I would emphasize in what you'd already said. I won't say add, because you'd already gone there.
Yeah, I mean, it was thanks to Andrew Jeffrey that I was introduced to the idea that was that, you know, the resources were created by Zoltan Dinesh, but calling them Dinesh equipment is potentially the equivalent of ordering 2 cappuccini when you go into Costa Coffee or wherever you happen to buy your coffee from. You know, you feel like a bit of a fool saying it, even though it's correct. Or when you ask for an agendum, though I have heard that agendum has now become defunct, but technically speaking, an agenda was just multiple, you know, points, but perhaps it's multiple points of order, and that's why it's an agenda rather than agendum. But, you know, there are lots of those examples in outside of mathematics. But I think the way around it is to refer to them as base 10 equipment, because they're the same equipment has a base 5 equivalent, and that would be base 5 equipment. So if you go on MathSpot, Johnny has it in many, many bases. It looks the same, but obviously your square isn't going to be a square of 100 ones. It's going to be a square of what, 25 ones. And so I think referring to it as the base and then equipment is an easy way around that. But I know it's a point of pedantry, you know, the type of pedantry that you and I are both famous for, and what our loyal listeners tune in for every week.
Yeah, I think while someone might call us out and say, well, get his name right, that's a bit unfair. I would imagine that Zoltan Dinesh, and again, I've probably pronounced it wrong still, would at heart be most interested in us trying to communicate as clearly as we can about the ideas of mathematics. And most teachers will recognize the word deans and will probably not quite recognize Dinesh. So I hope that we could be forgiven on that count.
Point. You know, when you're talking about the extensions, I think nothing gets past the ridiculous nature of the English language and its relationship with the names we've given to the numbers than thinking about 12 as 1, 10, and 2, and 11 as 1, 10, and 1. You know, it was whenever I was doing the tutor videos and I had to teach that. And I sat down and I thought, what's the best way to get this across? And it's through that sort of extension of unitizing, you know, because, oh yeah, we'll have some German numbers, we'll have some slightly Romance language numbers, you know, we'll take a few from this box and a few from that box, and we'll come up with something that's only slightly less ridiculous than how the French language expresses numbers greater than 60. So yeah, so you can't overstate the extensions of what you're saying there. It goes the whole way through it, I think.
On that, then, a question. I remember about 12 months ago, maybe a bit more, I saw Bernie Westacott talking about the value potentially of supporting children to understand numbers by at the beginning, as well as or instead of describing numbers as 11, 12, 13, 14, using a system that maybe more closely matches what happens in Mandarin, where you say 10, 10, 1, 10, 2, 10, 3, in order to make explicit what's going on there. I mean, it is incredibly unfortunate that we don't highlight that within the words that we use. Do you think potentially there is value in that? I mean, you're bound to say yes, because who would want to disagree with Bernie Westacott? But if you, on the assumption you do think there's value there, would you be tempted to say, well, let's keep 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, etc. to one side, and once children are quite comfortable with these numbers, we can start to say, and these are their names, because there's an equivalent here when it comes to the learning of when children learn to read. There are certain phonics programs that as part of their instruction will avoid using letter names until later on. You know, some kids will come to school knowing A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc., but the teachers won't use those letter names because they're aware that they can potentially get in the way of instruction. They'll get in the way of children's spelling. They'll get in the way of children's understanding. So where do you stand on that, this idea of potentially using numbers in that way?
Yeah, I think Bernie uses Welsh as an example. I mean, I certainly know that in Ireland, a hen jeg would be 11, and a hen is also 1, so it'd be 110. And a da jeg, 210 would be, and then trí jeg, cahar jeg, cúig jeg, so on. So they have a similar system to Welsh, which appears to be similar to Mandarin, where they've got that sort of very clear naming of the relationship between the unit and then the group of 10. When I'm teaching fractions, certainly when I was talking to my 7-year-old about fractions, instead of giving them the fraction names, I was talking about this is one of 2 parts, which is again how they express it in Mandarin. The direct translation for a third wouldn't be a third, it'd be 1 of 3 parts, or something along those lines. And which basically that's exactly what it is. It's describing really clearly, you know. And you know, we talk about clarity in mathematics and clarity in instruction, clarity of language. How important are the number names to the mathematics we experience in reception, nursery, year 1 and year 2? I would argue not very important at all. And certainly I'm always telling my teachers to remove the secretarial skills from the mathematics in year 1, because our children don't come to school knowing how to read and write. So we got to strip that back and think fundamentally about the mathematics. And if we think about the list that we explored there, you know, I said, okay, this is the journey I would go on. Knowing the names of the numbers beyond 10 certainly wasn't something that I would prioritize. You know, it's nice to know them, but mathematically speaking, like you said, with phonics, you can get by. And the first time I'd experienced that with phonics was my own children were learning to read. But then I saw how quickly they learned to read. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. You know, and again, I go back to how I only thought I knew how to teach phonics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'd be brave enough as of yet to say to a school of teachers as a maths lead, you know what, we're going to try this. We're going to embed both of these ways of dealing with numbers. We're going to talk about 11 as 10-1, 10-2, 10-3. I guess you can go further than that and start talking about 20 and say, when you're dealing with that, say, well, this is 2 10s 1, 2 10s 2, 2 10s 3. I think thinking about those as parallel ways of understanding number, one which makes the structure explicit and one that is the annoying name with all of its inherent etymology, might be a way to go. I would certainly say, though, that there is value in being willing to say, we can think of this number, of course, 25. We know this is 2 10s and 5, or 2 10s 5, however you want to consistently describe that.
That's probably the pragmatic solution. It's okay us suggesting all these things that we would do with the curriculum and stuff. Could you imagine what that curriculum will look like if we ever do get in a position where we get to decide what it looks like? But I think in reality, it's a lot like, when you prioritize something over another thing, but you want to show them in tandem, and you say, okay, this is what we're focusing on, but it also looks like this. Say you were working with base 10 equipment, but you also had the formal written algorithm written beside it because you were drawing comparisons and parallels between what was happening. I think it's like that. We can say what we think, but pragmatically speaking, it's probably, show both and then see what happens from there.
Yeah, and I think there's a strong argument to be made that constantly referring to this underlying structure of numbers is a really wonderful way to drip feed an understanding of place value. So, kids are counting up and they say, oh, what number did we get to? We got to 27. And don't forget, everyone, we can think of this as 2 10s and 7 1s, because that's what, that just constant reminder of, well, what is 27? What is 36? What is 64? Well, it's this many groups of 10, this many ones. Yeah, I think that's a massive component of making sure that children understand place value.
I could definitely go on for a long time, Chris, but I think now feels like a good place to pause before we move into perhaps a more detailed description of how things are enacted in the classroom. I think if we separate it into this conversation about place value, what it is, its essence, and then we can shift our attention next time to the practicalities of the classroom. I think that would be really useful for listeners, and I think it makes sense in terms of avoiding 4-hour episodes on niche mathematical subjects. I think all that's left to say is, if you haven't already, check out Chris's appearance on Mind the Gap with Emma Turner and Tom Sherrington. I listened to it as soon as it came out. It came up on my YouTube recommendations, and 43 minutes have not gone as quickly when listening to something. It was thoroughly enjoyable from start to finish. So check that out if you haven't already. Thank you very much, Christopher, for joining me.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks, Kieran.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.